You're listening to the Place Northwest podcast, your digital resource for the latest insight and analysis on all things property in the northwest of England.
Hello and welcome to this Place Northwest podcast. I'm your host, Dan Whelan. Today's episode is sponsored by Davies Partnership. Davies Partnership is a leading mechanical and electrical building services consultancy with an array of industry knowledge and experience that has helped the company consistently deliver quality outcomes for its diverse range of clients across the UK. Davies Partnership believes its ultimate purpose is to energise environments and positively shape the world around us, whether that is through the work it does or by supporting local initiatives. To find out more about Davies Partnership, contact richard.lewis@daviespartnership.co.uk or visit www.daviespartnership.co.uk. Today we're going to be talking about one of the hottest topics in property, the push for net zero carbon. What needs to be done to help the UK achieve its goal of becoming net zero by 2050? Joining me today for this discussion, we have Richard Lewis, Director of Davies Partnership, Paul Gerrard, Director of For Living, part of For Viva Group, and Victoria Alderton, Director of Paddock Johnson Architects. Hello to all of you.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much for joining us today. I think if any discussion about net zero carbon should start with a very simple question, which I'll aim at you, Richard, and that is, what does net zero carbon mean and why is it important?
Thank you, Dan. Well, net zero carbon in the construction sector, what we mean by that, a net zero carbon building is achieved when the emissions associated with fossil fuels and grid electric import are offset by renewable electricity export measured over an annual cycle. So that's typically what we mean in the construction sector. The one issue with that definition is that it does ignore embodied carbon associated with the construction process, cyclical maintenance and end of life, which can actually account for up to 70% of the building whole life carbon. But I think we'll come on to talk about that later.
Absolutely, yeah, it's a very good point you make about embodied carbon, and as you said, we will touch on that a bit later on. Richard, you work for Davies Partnership, you're a director there. What are some of the common strategies and techniques being used by companies like Davies Partnership in order to decrease carbon?
In terms of the practical side, in terms of the build side of things, certainly in the domestic sector, the move is towards air tightness, passive house design, very high levels of insulation in walls and roofs. In terms of the M&E strategies that sit alongside that, typically everything's switching over towards electric heat pump technologies, whether that be air source or ground source or shared ground source loops. We're seeing a lot of at the moment. A complete move away from gas, and solar PV being the key renewable element to help you get over the line in terms of the net zero, and on the really sort of exemplar schemes, that coupled with some battery storage and also smart energy control within the property. Waste heat recovery as well is key to getting to that sort of net zero carbon position. On new build, sort of non-domestic, again, it's fabric first approach. Get your energy down to the absolute minimum. A near zero energy building is a phrase that's often used, and then using passive design, passive ventilation to avoid air conditioning. Again, heat pump technologies for heating and hot water. Phasing out of gas, and again, heavy reliance on solar PV. They're the sort of practical technologies. In terms of how we get to the point of what is the best system, I mean, what we tend to do at Davies Partnership, particularly in the non-domestic sector, both retrofit and new build, is to go in and do a full virtual model, carbon model of the building. And then to adapt the model by tweaking, playing around with fabrics and insulation, orientation, facade design, thermal mass, M&E strategies, daylight design, to try and refine, in conjunction with the rest of the design team and the architect, to try and refine and get to that zero carbon position. Obviously, more straightforward, obviously, in the new build. In the retrofit, we're obviously constrained by what's there and what we can do to it, which is often the challenge. Just trying to get information on how it's built can sometimes be a challenge, very little record information. And often we end up with getting it to a point in terms of its carbon reduction, but we just can't get it any further without demolishing, and then all the embodied carbon issues arise with demolishing and rebuilding. So we get it to a point, and then if a client says we really, really want to go zero carbon, the only option then is for them to look at carbon offsets, which again is you could do a podcast just on that. It's a very murky world.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. That roundup of kind of very technical technologies. Paul, we'll come on to you from a developer's perspective. How much of what Richard has just spoken about in terms of those techniques and those technologies, how much of that is on your radar, and how is Forviva trying to become zero carbon in this, this national pursuit of that?
Yeah, we've kind of got two angles going on within the business. Initially, we've got our existing stock. We've got quite an amount of stock in the organisation. So making sure that we prioritise all our existing stock is vital. At the same time, looking at our new build programme and moving forward. So we're balancing, both of those programmes, making sure financially as an organisation we can cover both the existing stock and our new programme. Yeah, within the new programme, very, very positive looking at what we can look at moving forward. We already do electric heating, and we've done electric heating on a couple of our PRS schemes, which have worked really successfully. But now we're looking at those on what will be our social and affordable rent schemes. And we've started the process with our architects, with our procurement team, on looking at new build sites. And that'll form part of, on a couple of our schemes going forward, when we go out through our procurement, through the procurement process, we'll have a number of questions linked around carbon zero, looking at electric heating, looking at ground source, air source. So really, it's a major part for us going forward. Obviously, we're very aware of the costs, and the costs are very vital to the organisation. Looking at the costs in terms of making sure scheme viability still works for us, and working closely with Homes England on what that looks like, and making sure our development programme is still viable. But yeah, we're very much looking at different sorts of changes away from gas, and we might even do some work with Salford University around that as well, on what works best and which is ideal for us.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there it's very much, it's a high on your list of priorities as a company, this carbon agenda. Do you think we're in a position now where every company has to take this seriously, every development company? You can't afford to be left behind? Or is there still scope for that, for companies to hide and persevere with less environmentally friendly technologies while others take up the mantle and forge ahead with the net zero carbon agenda?
No, I think it's massively high on the agenda across GM and Merseyside. It forms the basis to a lot of the high level meetings that are taking place. So all the housing associations, all the RPs across the sector are looking at this as a priority, and they're looking at the business plans as a priority to make sure that they can make sure all their existing stock is carbon zero, but make sure they can keep developing the development programme. So it's that balancing out within the business to make sure financially you can do both. But it's no longer just a item on the agenda, it's the top of the agenda, and it's key for all of the organisations moving forward.
Absolutely. Great to hear that it's been taken so seriously. Victoria, we'll come to you. Both Paul and Richard have mentioned there about working with the architect on the design of new builds with this net zero carbon agenda in mind. I wonder how much your role as an architect has changed over recent years, or how much you expect it to change over the coming months and years.
Yeah, if I'm honest, I don't think it has significantly changed yet, but as you say, we are fully expecting that to happen. I mean, to date, the focus has really been on operational energy and carbon emissions, and therefore has fallen more on the M&E engineering side of things. Sustainability has always been on the agenda for architects in terms of sort of promoting a fabric first approach and reducing heat demand. But I think without specific legislation or policies to enforce targets, clients who want to go above and beyond the requirements of building regulations are still fairly rare. But that is, we're seeing a significant change in that now with the new Part L and the future home standards coming in. So I think we will be involved in more of those conversations as embodied energy becomes a key part of embodied energy in the building process becomes a key part of the calculations.
Okay, brilliant. So I just want to go back to something you said there about, developers and applicants who want to go above and beyond what's currently required by legislation. Given the costs involved in creating carbon neutral buildings or low carbon buildings, are they effectively being penalised at this stage for wanting to create those projects in terms of the cost?
I think it depends on the drivers and objectives of the company. Not everyone's objectives are sort of short-term financial gains. Perhaps some RPs or developers which are looking at a more long-term view on developments and are maybe being a bit more focused on whole life costings and other benefits that net zero carbon can have in terms of fuel poverty perhaps, or turnover of tenants through people having a better environment and having a bit more money to spend. I think once people start to factor in a longer term view, then the capital outlay starts to, doesn't look so unappealing or unviable.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on it there, the Part L legislation change. Richard, that's coming in at the end of the year. That's going to be game changing for this pursuit of net zero carbon. Could you just explain that to some of the people listening who may not know about the Part L legislation?
Yeah, so building regs Part L basically focuses on building energy performance and carbon emissions. And there's a long-awaited update to the Part L, which is due to be published December 2021, coming into force in summer next year. And that is very much an interim step towards, particularly on the domestic front, towards future home standards in 2025. And currently, the new Part L is looking at a 31% carbon improvement on current standards, and also looking at in England, looking at bringing in a primary energy factor. The document is geared up. What it's trying to do, it's trying to push us down the route of building really, really well insulated homes. You've still got a little bit of flexibility on the M&E design, your heating and hot water systems. But I think the view government's taken is, it's far easier to go and replace a gas boiler with an air source heat pump in 5 years' time than to go in and re-insulate all the walls and replace all the glazing. So you can see the direction of travel the government's trying to sort of push us down with the new Part L.
Yeah, absolutely. And Victoria mentioned it just before about embodied carbon. And Richard, you told me a stat about the percentage that makes up of the total carbon sort of emissions of the building. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's been a lot of research into this, and over the if you like, the carbon life of a building, so that's from construction all the way through operation through to demolition at the end. The operational carbon bit of it, which is the bit that we're all focused on at the moment in terms of building regulations and trying to reduce your electricity and gas bills, etc., actually only represents probably about 30% of that journey, maybe a third of that journey. The rest of it is all tied up in embodied carbon. So everything from the construction of the building, the materials, the raw materials, the transportation of the materials, to getting on site, to the actual construction on site and the energy used. Mm-hmm. And then as the building goes through operation, there's cyclical maintenance replacements. You'll replace the boilers after a while, or the heat pumps or whatever. And then at the end of the building life, you then got the dismantling side of things as well. So that all those embodied carbon factors, add up to about 70%, of which, in terms of the upfront, the construction side of it, it's roughly about half of that 70%. So again, about a third upfront, about a third in terms of operational, and then another third in terms of cyclical maintenance and end of life. And it's that 70% that at the moment seems to be a bit of a blind spot in terms of our industry, and good for good reason, because it's very, very hard to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's 70% is, the majority. It seems strange and a little bit counterintuitive that it's not addressed more. Is there anything in, just going back to Part L legislation, is there anything in that talks about the embodied carbon element, or is that all about operational carbon?
That's purely at the moment about operational carbon, although there are indications that this may be being considered in later versions of the of building regulations. And to be honest, to get to our 2050 net zero carbon UK target requirements, it has to be. And I think the people that write the regulations, they know that, they understand that. And I think what everyone's waiting for now is a set of tools that we can use and best practice methods to address the embodied carbon. At the moment, those tools are very much still in their infancy. And I think this is why it's very difficult to bring anything into regulation at the moment, because the tools simply aren't there to deal with it properly.
You're listening to the Place Northwest podcast. The subplot is Place Northwest's new weekly supplement of stimulating analysis that adds a probing and incisive voice to our news coverage, getting behind the headlines and examining the issues affecting the property industry, from politics and finance to market trends and more. Every stone turned, every angle explored, every Tuesday morning. Subscribe to the subplot for free at placenorthwest.co.uk/subscribe.
And Paul, we'll come to you. What options are available to you, thinking about developing new stock? What options are available to you in terms of reducing that level of upfront carbon that Richard was talking about?
Yeah, well, one of your options obviously is doing major and more refurbishment contracts. So going away from your traditional large developments. But the issue you've got there is lots of contractors are not geared to do refurbishment works, and a lot of the problems can be around when they do refurbishment contracts. The cost for a refurbishment contract becomes much more expensive than a new build contract. So value for money in terms of making grant rates work, in terms of making schemes stack up, that does cause a major issue. It's just a massive difficulty, and the issue around having good quality contractors is becoming a bigger issue all the time. And that'll have been noticed over the last few years with a number of contractors who've gone into liquidation and no longer with us.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And we spoke in the lead up to recording this podcast about the Green Homes grant, which has been scrapped. Low level of take up for those government grants, and a lot of it was put down to a lack of specialist contractors. So there seems to be a skills shortage there as well. Victoria, we'll come to you. Same question really. What can architects do in order to help reduce that upfront carbon in the design process?
I think a lot of it goes back to first principles in terms of site layout and orientation. It has a big impact on heat demand, just the way that the main habitable room windows face, which direction they face. So that's sort of the most basic form. And then I suppose it's just limiting the amount of carbon intensive materials that are specified. So aluminium is probably the worst thing that you could specify, shortly followed by sort of copper and steel. The structure of buildings tends to fluctuate between steel and concrete as sort of prices fluctuate. But I think sort of making sure that if you are using steel frame, that you're making sure that it's as efficient as it possibly can is a good thing. And then looking at recycled materials perhaps, and maximising the efficiency of the design to minimise waste. And I think this is where off-site manufacture comes into play, and modular, where there's more control over the products and materials that are being used, and that waste can really be minimised. So there's lots of factors that can all contribute. I think it just needs to be sort of almost like a checklist that you've considered from the outset. Yeah,
absolutely. It's interesting there. You mentioned modern methods of construction and modular, and there does seem to be a real wave of a groundswell of activity in that particular sector, driven by the carbon agenda. Richard, if I wanted to build a building without concrete or steel, would the end result last as long as a building made of concrete or steel?
Well, I think when you look at a lot of these modular construction buildings and you look at the sort of the life expectancies of them, they're not going to be stood there for 200-300 years. Some of these existing masonry buildings have proved to stand the test of time. But the question is, do they need to? From a carbon perspective and a global carbon perspective, all we need them to do really is to get us through the next 50, 60 years to the point where hopefully technology has evolved so far in terms of emerging technologies, nuclear fusion, expansion of nuclear and all those type of technologies, carbon capture, that actually, once we get to that point and we've developed the sustainable forests and everything else, to knock it down and rebuild something every 60 or 100 years is not necessarily the end of the world. I think the answer is they probably won't, but they probably don't need to from a global carbon perspective.
Yeah, I guess the problem comes when you're demolishing concrete buildings and then in their place building concrete buildings. Then you've got the embodied carbon from both of those projects. And there was an example recently at a development in Salford at Fortis Quay. Originally, the plan was to repurpose a couple of old Bruntwood office blocks. They were stripped back to their concrete frames. There was then a viability assessment which found that it wouldn't be viable to convert those frames, into apartments, and they're going to be knocked down now and new build blocks built. This seems sort of counter-intuitive given the pursuit of net zero that we're trying to achieve. Paul, what are your thoughts on that?
It's an interesting one. There's been a number of schemes where there's been assessments to see if existing buildings could be converted, and in terms of making those work in terms of viability, they've not been able to happen. One of the key things that is taking place, going back to, is the modular. A number of RPs, not only in the Northwest but Northwest and Yorkshire, have now formed what is Offsite Homes Alliance, so 22 housing associations working in partnership, looking to unlock modular construction. So working in partnership, looking at different options and what is available, working again closely with Salford University. And we think this is a good opportunity for our sector to work closer together, not only by doing the volumetric, but looking at sustainability, also to provide employment and training opportunities. And we think it's something that could drive forward, hoping by the number of RPs that have joined up with the group, that we can get the numbers which will start to make the figures work for us all. But yeah, going back, a lot of buildings which have been looked at to be refurbed or to redesigned, the viability on them just doesn't work. So unfortunately, some of them will have to be demolished, but the potential for modular is a massive positive across the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And that working together and collaborating, like you said, is so important, isn't it, to drive this forward? Victoria, is that something that's happening with architects as well? Are you sort of getting together and pooling your ideas on the carbon question?
Yeah, I mean, the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, it's high on their agenda, and they're doing a lot in terms of CPD and training and seminars and debate to ensure that, as a profession, we, are as forward thinking with it as we can be. So it's high up on everyone's agenda, but I think there's a little bit of all sort of running around, but not quite sure which direction to go in or what they should be doing. It's just everyone knows that we need to do something.
Yeah, absolutely. Just not quite sure what at this stage. Richard, I'll come to you for this next question. Is enough being done to support these initiatives, in terms of subsidies, perhaps, or incentives, in both the public and the private sector? Are we taking it seriously enough?
I think there needs to be, certainly in terms of going back to the embodied carbon, there certainly needs to be. I think that needs to be much more prominent in terms of current discussions. I say it's very much in the blind spot at the moment. And I think, whilst it's acknowledged that the tools out there for assessing embodied carbon are limited, they are starting to emerge. And for instance, there's a very good FCBS carbon tool spreadsheet that you can download for free. And that's actually references the BISRIA inventory of carbon and energy documents in terms of embodied carbon for different materials. And it's a very good tool that you can use at the start of a project to go through and make key selections about the type of frame you're going to use, the type of cladding. And it just enables you to build up a carbon picture very, very quickly in terms of whole life carbon, not just embodied, but also operational and end of life as well, and also cyclical maintenance. So there are tools starting to emerge, and I think you know, as an industry, we need to make sure that everybody's aware of these things, which is, you know, part of the reason for the podcast today. Really is awareness. And as Vicky said, you know, there's a lot of people out there. There's some really clever things and some really good research, but it's quite sporadic. Everyone's doing their own thing. You know, everyone's whilst they are sharing them in some of the leading industry journals and what have you. I don't think there's enough of it, and I don't think there's enough focus. And I think in terms of building regulations, whilst accepting that it's very difficult to bring anything into regulations at the moment in terms of embodied energy, what they could do, for example, for renewable systems, you know, there is a requirement to at least look at renewable systems on new builds, even if you don't implement them, and that is actually in the regs. So why can't they just add something in the regs about, you know, have you considered this in terms of whole life carbon and body carbon, even if there's no actual requirement? And that's a starting point, really, just to get everybody thinking, because a lot of people are just, you know, really quite oblivious to the issue. So I think, yes, building regulations can certainly do more. They're driving ahead very well with the operational carbon side of things. You know, this 80% carbon reduction target in 2025 is excellent. I think operational carbon, I think we're in a very good place in the UK, and I think that's moving ahead quite nicely. I think retrofit, we've talked about that in the domestic sector and what can be done with that. I mean, the Green Homes Grant's been a bit of an unmitigated disaster, really. Only 5% of the £2 billion pledged has been used. A scheme now on stop. There's a £320 million funding pot now sat there. And I think that, you know, the general consensus has been that, you know, a short-term scheme such as this, which requires extensive amounts of investment and training for accredited installer status, it's just too short-termist. You know, builders are looking at it and thinking, well, you know, the scheme ends in March 2021. Why would I bother jumping on board with that? So it needs a much more of a, you know, a long-term vision outside the 4-year political cycle, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can all agree with that. Victoria, what would you like to see from government and in terms of legislation to really push this carbon zero agenda? What do you think is required?
I think, as both Paul and Richard have touched on, there has to be more acknowledgement that reusing existing buildings is, you know, the most, you know, sort of sustainable thing that we can do. And at the moment, there's, you know, VAT relief on certain new buildings, but yet people pay VAT on refurbishments. So I think there are financial incentives that can be introduced for both refurb and low carbon buildings. Perhaps low interest funding that you know, looks at bridging the gap between capital outlay and, you know, the sort of benefits in terms of running costs long term. I think that it just has, people want incentives, I think, to encourage them before things unless it's mandatory. I think you need incentives to help people make those choices.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the moment, it's, as you mentioned, it's weighted in the favour of new build development, it seems. Paul, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think there's lots of keywords coming out there from both Richard and Vicky there. I think one of the things Richard was mentioning, we've all been running around for a number of years as organisations doing little bits of different sustainability works or volumetric or other new build projects, whether it's a SIP panel or something else. We've all been running around doing bits and bobs here and there, and it's never come together properly, and organisations have never come together properly. And I think, you know, some of the targets with building regs, and by not putting gas into the new builds in 2025, they're going to be key dates for us. But I think as a sector, I think we need to be much more aware of what can be done. More conversations with Homes England about funding on some of the new schemes. Some key schemes this next year or two moving forward on site, to make sure we've got the right grant rates, to make sure that we're looking at different, again, electric heating, air source, ground source, whatever that option may be. Looking a lot closer on schemes at design stage. It's something our organisation, we do a lot of work now on the design, and I think that's important. I think a lot of schemes over the years, a scheme will have gone in for planning for 20 units, and there's not been much thought. I think we need to give schemes a lot more thought. It's going to be key from our tenants' perspective on how the heating systems work, or how they don't need to use the heating system at some points, and looking at some of their own behaviour changes. So a lot of key things in the short term, but over probably the next 3 to 4 to 5 years on what we can do better. But I think conversations with building control planners, all different consultants early in Homes England are going to be key moving forward. But I think the Offsite Homes Alliance is a massive plus in the Northwest, and not just the Northwest, over into Yorkshire as well. But moving forward with different modular construction types, and making sure we can get the numbers to make sure that we're getting the products at the right price is going to be key. And we've actually got Homes England as part of those conversations.
Brilliant. We've mentioned there about incentives and funding and ways that we can incentivise developers and the public and the private sector to adopt these carbon zero behaviours. But do we also need something on the other side, as punishments for not reaching certain targets, and to penalise companies for not doing their bit, essentially?
I'm happy to jump on that one first. I think that's something that could be, part of your funding conditions. Maybe it's a bit of a different point, but could be part of your funding with Homes England, the level of funding you can get. There may be something that could be linked, through planning, through building control, where some different government funding could be provided. So it's rather than to penalise, it's to give people that added incentive by moving forward with schemes who do hit the right targets. There is that additional grant available, and that's going to be a big challenge, going forward. Build costs are going up, lack of contractors in the market. We work to board approved assumptions in terms of our break evens. The big challenge going forward is to make sure we can keep delivering within our board approved assumptions on our break evens. So whether it's punishments or whether it's additional funding, that is a key question. Punishments would be a hard one, and I'd like to see what that looks like, but I'd never say never to that.
Victoria, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's always preferable to, lead with carrot rather than stick, isn't it? But I think at the moment there is also the gap between sort of how something's designed and perhaps then what's delivered as the end product, and even how it's being operated 12 months after completion. I mean, things like Passive House obviously look to address the performance gap between design and completion, and perhaps the punishment is more to do with after a year or two's of operation, if it's not delivering what was sort of promised, then that's when perhaps those penalties have to come in.
Absolutely.
But it is obviously not something people are going to want to do if they can avoid it.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard, have you got any thoughts on that, about possibly the possibility of penalising companies for not adhering to certain rules?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're already starting to see this down in London, for example. We're doing a big residential development down there, and certainly there are requirements for post-occupancy assessment to see if the building is performing as intended. In terms of penalties for that, I'm not aware of any associated penalties, but it has been written into local planning law that we do have to do this post-occupancy evaluation and comparison to see how it's performing. And from our experience, I mean, I've got a lot of experience in commissioning buildings and commissioning M&E systems, and I know that I would go as far as to say 95% of certainly non-domestic buildings are never commissioned properly at day one, which leads to inefficient operation, excessive use of energy and carbon emissions, because the commissioning side of a project is always the bit that's squeezed at the end. They've run out of money, they've run out of time. Let's just get it across the line, and buildings are never commissioned properly. So post-occupancy sort of evaluation and looking at the energy consumption for the following 12 months is absolutely essential to that. And there should be penalty, I think, that goes alongside that if you're missing your target by what you promised in terms of your path L modelling. Then I think there should be some kind of penalty.
Yeah, I think everyone has to pull their weight on this. It's a massive challenge, and everyone has to be doing their bit, I suppose. We've spoken about some of the challenges facing companies, developers and architects. I was wondering if we could finish with this. And it's a big question. What needs to be done now for us to achieve this 2050 net zero carbon target? And whose example should we be following? Richard, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, well, at a UK construction level, it needs to be a bit of an order of hierarchy, really. The first thing I think we need organisations need to look at is, do they really need new buildings? Now, what are the alternatives? I mean, we've just been through 12 months of COVID, everybody working at home. As we all start to return to work, I'm sure every business, including our own business, is looking and saying, do we really need the amount of office space that we've got? So that's the first thing, really, is to look at what do we actually need? We've all got used to remote working. Flexi work is going to be the next big thing. Hot desking. We're already looking at rotas for some of our staff to bring them back. Partly due to COVID still ongoing, but that we may continue that, and that suddenly means that we only need half the space that we've currently got. So the first thing is to really look at what space do we actually need, and the current trajectory in terms of building over the between now and 2060. I think the stat I've seen is that every month between now and 2060, based on current trajectory, we're going to be building a city the size of New York in terms of buildings globally, which is quite frightening when you think about it, and all the embodied carbon and operational carbon associated with that. The next one I think is, again, trying to focus everybody on the whole life carbon rather than just looking at operational. And I think that's absolutely key, and that needs to be brought in gradually through legislation as we build up our knowledge in that area. We need, I think, maybe more ambitious tightening of building regulations to reduce whole life carbon. Of course, there's the commercial impacts of that, which obviously people like Paul have to consider. It's easy for us to sit here and say that we're not paying for these buildings, but I think maybe we could look to move at maybe a slightly faster rate. And also development of the supply chain capacity, skills and systems to implement carbon retrofit schemes. There are some good models out there in the UK, and we need systems that work at scale and at an affordable cost, and that don't create more problems than they solve in terms of condensation and all sorts of other side issues that they might deliver. I think they're the key focus points, I think, at UK construction level.
And is there any example that you can give of a company or companies that are doing those things right now and that are really leading the charge on this? Yeah,
certainly. I mean, again, like everybody, googling around, looking at the various journals of what's going on out there at the moment. I mean, I think Welsh Government actually are doing quite well in this respect. I mean, I was on a recent webinar, and they're trying to link up 11 of their house building local authorities to focus in on systems that modular systems that work, who focus all their resources, and they're also looking at generation of sustainable forestry to support its house building program. So that's a nice circular kind of approach to the whole carbon question there. I think Nottingham City Homes is the first housing association in the UK to pilot net zero retrofits using the Dutch energy sprung approach. So that's quite an innovative approach there. And on the non-domestic side, there's a property developer, Landsac, is moving forward with plans what aims to be the UK's first net zero carbon commercial development. And that will take into account embodied carbon as well as operational carbon. So that's due to finish in 2022. And again, using platform-based sort of modular construction technologies on that one. So we'll be certainly watching that one with interest. So there's a lot of good things going on, and it's really a case of making sure that all the lessons learned from all these activities are shared with everybody, really, not just UK-wide, but worldwide, really, and we all learn from best practice.
Absolutely. It comes back again to that issue of collaboration, doesn't it? You know, if we're going to get out of this, we need to do it together.
Absolutely.
Let's finish with this with one last question now, and I'll put it to Victoria and Paul. Victoria first. Do you think that the target of 2050 is attainable?
I suppose it depends on how these things are measured and calculated, because as I think Richard said at the beginning of the podcast, there's still different interpretations and different calculations of what net zero carbon really means. So, I mean, I think it should be. I think it should be achievable if the right incremental steps are put in place along the way. I mean, one of the things I was going to say is that if you want something to happen quickly, you need to take out the element of choice. I think while there remains an element of choice in sort of adopting some of these measures, then financial pressures will always 9 times out of 10 result in the choice being to not do something. So I think, it's just got to be a bit firmer in terms of as Richard said, in terms of the regulations, and everyone's going to have to do it rather than consider it and then dismiss it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good point. Paul, we'll finish with you. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think this is doable?
I think it is doable. I think we've clearly been set the target for some time now across our sector. We're all looking at our business plans on how we achieve that. I think we're all in a good position to do that. So I think it's unbelievably achievable. We've got to have a positive nature to make sure we do that. But it's been there long enough for us now to realise that the target is there, and we've got to start to deliver on that. And as organisations, we've already started on that. And I think it's something we will achieve, yes.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, it's been a fantastic conversation, learning a little bit more about what's actually going on the ground to achieve this 2050 net zero carbon goal. So thank you, Paul, Victoria and Richard, for joining me today.